So there are two channels in the Cyberhawks Discord that you should have access to. One is the Purple Team 2025 channel, and the other one is Wazuh Alerts. The Purple Team 2025 channel is where I'm going to communicate with you. This is like the official channel for this seminar series, if you want to think about it that way. Anytime there's something important, like an announcement that applies to all of you or to multiple of you, I will use the @everyone tag. So what that means is, for setting up your notifications, if you go to your notification settings, you can either do all messages if you want to be notified of every new message in the chat, or if you only want to be notified of those announcements, you can set it to only @mentions. All right. I'm trying to minimize the amount of Discord notifications that people get, because I know if we get too many notifications, we don't check them. At least if I get too many notifications, I don't check them. So just to keep everything simple, there's that. Then we have this Wazuh Alerts channel. So quick recap from last time when we talked about our defense tech stack, right? Here are the different technologies that go into cybersecurity defense, right? But all of them go into one centralized security information and event management system, or SIM, and that SIM is responsible for collecting those logs from all these different places and then alerting on potential attacker activity, right? So the SIM that we're using, originally, I think last week I said I was going to go with Security Onion. I realized that I hate Security Onion with a passion after I started using it. So I changed my mind and we went with Wazuh instead. So I will be using, I hear some people pronounce it Wazuh, other people pronounce it Wazuh. I don't think there's like an official way of pronouncing it, so I'm just saying Wazuh. But that's what we're using. And I also integrated Wazuh with Discord, so that all of our alerts from our SIM, based on rules that we created, will show up in this channel. So here you can see some alerts showing up, and they have like the agent or the machine that they apply to, the actual log that we're getting the alert from, and the severity of the alert. Okay. I recommend for this channel, since I'll be playing around with it and testing it, you'll be playing around with it and testing it, you may receive a bunch of alerts. Just to suppress notifications by going to your notification settings and setting it to nothing. That way, when you actually need to work with it, you can pull it up and see it, but you're not constantly getting messages about Wazuh alerts. All right? Okay, cool. Now we can officially begin. So, 2 ways of accessing the environment, and I gave you guys the choice. Way number 1, by the way, you're way number 2 because it's the easier way. Way number 1 was using the VPN. So this is most suited for people who want to have the attacking machines set up on their end. If you are using the VPN, actually I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, so sorry, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. In the Purple Team channel, there's a bunch of pinned messages, right? So pinned messages, if you're less familiar with Discord, you can pin a message to a channel, and those are like usually the most important messages, and so you can jump right to those messages. The 2 pinned messages that we have here that are of relevance to you is, first of all, this environment info. So this is the environment that we're going to be working with that I set up for you. So we have 2 main networks. We have this Game of Active Directory network, which actually is a network that is used to test Active Directory that is freely available online. They have a GitHub repo, right? And so if you want to learn more about it, you can go to their documentation. And I also have a custom services network that I set up and misconfigured some services so that they're vulnerable to the most common service attacks that I see, right? So these are the 2 networks that we're defending. And then in addition to that, we have the actual defense infrastructure. So as I talked about before, for the defense infrastructure, I decided to use Wazuh as our SIM, right? And so if we go back to this defense infrastructure slide, if you remember a SIM, like Wazuh, it grabs logs from the system itself, right? And usually it does that by installing an agent on that machine, right? And then that agent forwards logs to the SIM. So all of the machines in the environment have installed on them a Wazuh agent that takes different logs from that system and forwards them, right? And I'll talk about how I did that setup. Today is going to be mostly talking about like setting up the defense infrastructure, right, and basic using Wazuh. Then, in addition, we have this intrusion detection and intrusion prevention system. So an IDS or an IPS monitors your network traffic. And so I'm using Suricata as the IDS IPS. And Suricata also has a Wazuh agent installed on it. So Suricata is its own virtual machine. It has a Wazuh agent installed on it, and I have it configured to forward the Suricata logs also to Wazuh, right? Then for firewall, I'm using pfSense as the firewall. It is an open, free firewall, and I really like it. And so I also installed a Wazuh agent on the firewall, and we're forwarding specific logs that I chose from the firewall to Wazuh, which is our SIM. Hopefully that makes sense. We don't really have an EDR because I don't really know of a good free EDR that actually does like behavioral analysis and all that good stuff. But Wazuh advertises itself as a SIM / an XDR or extended detection and response solution. So it has some overlap with what an EDR would do. So just by installing those agents, there are things you can do with Wazuh that you may not be able to do with a traditional SIM, like, for example, file integrity monitoring and things like that. Okay, so that should give you a general idea of the defense tech stack that we're working with. How is that actually set up? Well, first of all, Wazuh, you can set it up in a few different ways. You can set it up as a standalone single virtual machine that does everything, right? But in a real enterprise environment, and especially with a network this large, you're going to want to divide out the tasks between virtual machines so one is not overwhelmed doing everything, right? So this is how Wazuh recommends doing it, or this is how they have it set up. Your main machine is your server, also known as your manager. And so we have one Wazuh server. This is the machine that collects all of the logs from all of the other virtual machines and puts them in one place, right? And then checks if they match any rules and then potentially alerts on them, right? That's all done by the server. The indexer helps with searching those logs, because what we'll be doing is we'll be taking those logs, we'll be searching them for logs of interest, right? And when we're doing threat hunting, the indexer takes some of that weight off of the server. It takes those logs from the server and it indexes them, or in other words, it sorts them so they can be more easily searched. And then when we actually perform any searches, those searches will be sent to the indexer, and the indexer will be the one performing the search. Now, lastly, we have the dashboard. The dashboard allows us to actually view the logs that we're getting in a nice, pretty graphical interface, right, in our web browser. So the dashboard is what you'll actually be connecting to when we're interacting with Wazuh. And the dashboard actually interacts with the server through API calls, right? Okay, and then last but not least, I did mention our network IDS is Suricata. That's on its own virtual machine. That's also sending its logs to the server or manager. Any questions about how Wazuh is set up so far? Cool.
Why is there 4 machines for the defense?
So it could be all be just one.
Okay.
But if we had just one, that machine would be overburdened with having to do too many tasks, right? Mm-hmm. So we basically take different tasks and we break it up between each of these machines. Mm-hmm. So the server collects the logs, the indexer sorts and searches the logs, the dashboard is the web application that allows us to view the logs, right? And Suricata is our network monitoring thing. So it actually collects the network logs specifically. It is the IDS IPS, so it grabs the network logs and forwards them to Wazuh. That's why we have multiple machines. Okay, so the second pin message that you'll see here that is of relevance after environment info is resources. So when I was setting this up, I disclaimer, I am new to Wazuh. This is the first time I'm ever using it. And what I am teaching you right now, I have learned probably in the past 2 weeks. So if I make mistakes or if I say something that isn't true, I apologize in advance. It happens sometimes that I watch later videos that I made and I'm like, oh man, I totally explained that wrong. So just giving you that disclaimer right up front. But all of the resources that I used to get this set up, I have shared with you here. So when we're talking about Wazuh setup, here are the resources I used. And when we're talking about how to actually use Wazuh, here are a bunch of really helpful resources that tell you how to use it. In addition, here at the top, Attacker VMs, I talk about how to set up, because this is a purple team seminar series. So we're going to be talking offense and defense, right? For doing the offense piece, for actually running our attacks, we need a set of attacking machines that we can use to run those attacks. So I gave you 2 options for those attacking machines. Option 1 was to have your own attacking machines, which is useful for people who did the collegiate penetration testing competition with me last year. You already have your own attacking machines. It's easier to just use your own, right? And from there, you need a way of connecting to the environment. So the way we're going to be doing that is with OpenVPN, and I provided an OpenVPN file down there that you can use to access the environment. The second way, for people who are new or for people who don't want to set anything up on their end, I went ahead and I set up machines for you in a hypervisor called Proxmox. Basically, it's a way of managing virtual machines, and I could give you access them in a web browser. So I'm going to show you now how to access the environment both ways. So I'm going to start with the easier way, which is if I set up the machines for you in Proxmox. If I set up the machines for you, I DM'd you in Discord a link to a 1Password credential, right, that gives you the username and password that you'll need both to log into Proxmox, to access your virtual machines, and to log into Wazuh, which is our SIM. I just did same password for both. So to demonstrate how to do that, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go to our server, which is 216.47.158.137 in a web browser. So you actually have to type in HTTPS, or it won't work, HTTPS 216.47.158.137. If you ever forget this, it is in the actual credential that I sent to you. It gives you a username and password, and it gives you links, right? So you'll see that link at the top. So you can also just click that link in 1Password if you prefer to do it that way. When you first navigate to that site, it might give you a warning. This is expected because we are using a self-signed TLS certificate. That means we didn't register an actual domain name for this machine. So we don't have an official domain that's associated with it and a certificate for that. But that's okay. You'll just say there's probably going to be advanced and then go to site anyway. Something of that sort. Mm-hmm. So you can click those to actually access the site. From there, you'll log in with the credentials that I gave you with your username and password. When it says Realm, this should already be set correctly for you, but if it isn't, make sure it does say Proxmox VE, because if it says Linux PAM, you won't be able to log in. Since I have my creds in 1Password, it's just as easy as clicking for me, but you'll have to actually enter them and press login. So far, so good. Everybody tracking? Mm-hmm. I feel like it's pretty straightforward. All right. From here, your view will probably look something like this. So from here, this is where we have our servers on the left-hand side. And these are servers that are actually on campus in one of the rooms down the hall. And within those, virtual machines for you to access. I would switch from server view personally by clicking this in the top left to pool view. And then you can just directly see the machines that I gave you access to. From there, you should see 2 machines. You should see Windows and Kali, right? Mm-hmm. Those are going to be your 2 attacking machines. So I actually like working entirely from my Windows machine and using SSH to access my Kali machine. I'll show you how to do that later, but for now, to actually access either of these machines, you can click on the machine and click on console, and that will bring up the machine itself. You probably won't be logged in like I am because I logged in earlier, but that's okay. The other way that you can access it is if you click this console button in the top right here, it actually does a little pop out, and then you can view it this way and make it bigger. So I think that's kind of nice. And if you want to full screen this, you can click on the little arrow here, and then you can click on this little full screen icon. And now you have it full screened. Make sense? So far, so good? All right. When you first access your Windows machine, and I'm actually going to log out to show you this. Also, this is the first time that we've had enough environment resources that I could give a bunch of you access to your own machines. So just disclaimer that if it's slow or laggy, we have never tested this before. And so I don't know how it'll work out, but I'm hoping it'll work out. They should have enough resources that it's not too big an issue. Anyway, the first time you access your machine, you're probably going to see like the Windows need to log in screen that has the clock in the lower part. To get past that, you would normally click Control-Alt-Delete on a Windows machine. Control-Alt-Delete won't actually work in the virtual machine, so you'll have to go to this little thing on the left, click on the A, and then click on this bottom thing here, and that's the equivalent of doing Control-Alt-Delete. Once you click on that, it should give you the option to sign in with the administrator account, and it'll make you set a password, right? And that can be whatever password you want to set it to, and that'll be the password that you will use to sign in specifically to your Windows machine from here on. So you can set that to whatever you want and then press enter. Cool. And then it might take a little bit to log you in. That's totally fine. Windows is not very fast, and that's okay. When you first log in, you might get something like this that pops up. This is because we're using Windows Server 2022. And by default, like it starts this server manager on login. We actually don't need to use this because we're not using it as a server. We're using it as an attacking machine. So you can give it some time to actually get started. It might take a little bit, but once this pops up for you, you would click Manage, Server Manager Properties, and then you can click this Do Not Start Server Manager automatically at logon, and then you can click OK. And that's just going to stop this window from popping up when you log in. This is optional. You, of course, could just like X out of this. It's not a big deal. But if you don't want this like popping up every time you log in, that's how you stop it from doing that.
So, this will show you.
Yes. Hopefully I didn't click the X. It's also being super slow, which is not fun. But if you click, and I clicked X, yeah. But if you click Manage, it's Manage, then Server Manager Properties. It's going to be like down there. And then you're going to click this checkbox that says Do Not Start Server Manager at Logon. And then you'll click OK. Also, this recording, I'll try to release it tonight too, so if you ever forget, you can watch the recording. From here, all the tools that you are likely to use, I put on the desktop. So this includes your regular command prompt, where you can enter Windows commands, PowerShell, where you can enter Windows PowerShell commandlets, and MOBA Xterm, which is the client that we're going to be using to access our Kali machine from our Windows machine. Basically allows you to use secure shell or SSH to access other machines remotely, right? I will not show that yet. I will show that in a second after I talk to the people who want to use the VPN method, right?
Could you also access the Kali through the
Windows?
terminal?
Yeah.
Yes. So you can access it here through SSH, or if you go back here, you can also access your Kali here if you prefer to do it this way, right? So it is kind of lagging out on me, and Kali is just like weird. It sometimes like wants to work and sometimes doesn't. So the easy way is just to access it through your Windows machine, which is what I'll be demonstrating. But yes, in theory, you can access it that way too. Okay, for my people who are using the VPN, who set up the virtual machines on their end, this is what you will do. So looking at our resources, I have this self-hosted option, right? And then that has a link to another message that tells you all of the virtual machine requirements. So if you want to set up these attacking, if you're like, John, how did you set up these attacking machines? I want to have my own set of attacking machines, so I'm not reliant on you, right? Like this is how I set up the attacking machines, and you can just follow these instructions. So for Windows, we installed the base operating system. We disabled Windows Defender because we will be installing hack tools, right? And Defender would block or stop us from downloading hacking tools. So that's why I just disable Windows Defender. From there, I have this setup script that I created for you guys that you can run that's going to install all the tooling that you need. Again, if you're accessing the machines the way I just showed you, you don't have to worry about any of this. This is if you were like doing the OpenVPN method. Anyway, so as you can see, it downloads a bunch of binaries, it downloads a bunch of tools and installs them for you. Same thing with and then those desktop shortcuts. I just mentioned all of the applications that I put on the desktop for easy access. For the Kali, very similar. You install your base operating system, you run the script that I created for you, and then I also, because we'll be doing Kerberos related things with the Game of Active Directory environment, there's this Kerberos configuration file that needs to be appropriately filled out for our environment. So if we so you can basically just like copy and paste this command, even if you don't understand what it does. But just to show you what that configuration file looks like, you can see we have our domains. We have north 7kingdoms.local, 7kingdoms.local, esos.local. Those are 3 domains. And those are just mentioned here. And the domain controller for each of those is mentioned here. If that was a lot of words that you didn't understand, don't worry about it. But for those of you who did understand it, hopefully that makes sense. Just a quick note, this is actually coming from a repo that I set up that you're welcome to check out if you ever wanted to set up these virtual machines in Proxmox. Both those files, both those scripts are coming from this repo, and this repo talks about how all the steps that I took to actually set up the virtual machines for you in Proxmox. So if you're a Proxmox user and you want to like do basically what I did, which is provide people with their own like attacking machines, here are all the steps I took, which is basically what you saw in the Discord, but with some additional like installing Kimu Guest Agent for better interaction with Proxmox, and what's the other one? Cloud Init, so you can clone the machines and then easily configure the IP addresses for them.
Did you put the link in the Discord?
I mean, this one, this is irrelevant to most of you. It's only if you wanted to set them up yourself in Proxmox specifically. Mm-hmm. But you can just like, I didn't put the link for it. I can if you want.
Yeah, please put it.
Okay, sure. You can also figure it out from this, but it is easier to have the link. So actually, let me add it to resources. I'll put it right here.
I don't know if anyone else is having the same issue, but for Proxmox access, I don't think my credentials work.
Oh, your credentials don't work?
Have you been able to access
Oh,
those?
okay, let me double check that for you.
I think the server. Oh, finally.
Mine as well.
Oh, I did put it here.
I think they had.
Actually, I did put that link here. I'm just silly, and I forgot that I put it here.
Oh, is it?
But yes, that link is right here. Yes.
So while setting up the script,
Mhm.
now delete package did not work on the machine. I don't know why.
Well, again, these instructions are only if you're setting it up in Proxmox, not.
Anywhere else?
No, not this one.
Oh, actually, you might. I think I know. I think I know the point you're making, which is in this script. I think I have the cloud init stuff.
Yep.
I didn't think about that.
The
That's
thing is,
true.
like, hey, the cloud inserts was not found, so I cannot enable it.
Sorry about that. You can comment out these lines.
Yeah.
Yes, these lines are irrelevant. Although if you ran them, it shouldn't cause issues. Even if you got that error, like that takes place at the very end, so you should be fine. Just don't worry about it. But yes, good point. I did forget about that. My bad. Yes. And from there, how do we, so if let's say I set these up in VirtualBox like I did here, right? Okay. So one other thing that I like to do is I like to make my Kali machine accessible from my Windows machine, vice versa. So I'll just show you the networking that I like to set up. If you go to settings and you go to network, And see how you have multiple adapters? So the first adapter I leave at NAT because that gives you internet access. NAT basically interfaces it with your host operating system. But then for adapter 2, I set it to this NAT network, which is an internal network only for virtual machines, right? And I didn't actually create that network yet, so let me show you how to do that. So if we go to File, Tools, Network Manager, then we can create a new NAT network by clicking this Create button. And hopefully it doesn't take forever. There we go. And now we can double click to take a look at that. And you can set like your IP address information, however you want to set it, and like create a DHCP server. Hopefully if you took the self-hosted option, like you at least have some experience with VirtualBox. So this stuff kind of makes sense to you. Anyway, you would set your DHCP address pool there, right? So you just need at least 2 addresses. So your Kali machine gets one and your Windows machine gets another. And then from there, if I go to settings and I go to network, now I can add that newly created network, which I somehow did not set up properly because it's not showing up. Oh, I was supposed to put it not here. Silly me. I was supposed to put it under NAT networks. Duh. If I go to NAT networks, the tab at the top. Now if we click create, there we go. This makes more sense. So now you have this network here. You could change your network and you click enable DHCP. Make sense? Okay. And then you would go to your Kali machine and you can attach that network here. And you can see it already attached. And we can attach that network to our Windows machine. Boom. Cool. Makes sense for both the self-hosted option and for the accessing it in a web browser option. For the people that were here. I think you missed the accessing it in a web browser option. So, just to recap really quick.
To enable the network in the machine.
So now I have to backtrack a bit, but that's okay. 2 options for accessing the environment. Option 1 is setting up your own machines and then setting up your own attacking machines and then using a VPN to access the environment. That's the harder option. Option 2 is using machines that I set up for you in Proxmox. So whichever option you selected, if you selected option 2, which is me setting up machines for you, I should have Discord DM'd you a link to a 1Password credential, right? You'd basically open that credential and you'll see websites that it's valid for. The top one, which is this weird like 216.47158.137 address, that'll take you to this page. You would log in with your credentials. And then if you switch your view, just to make it easier, from server view to pool view like this, you'll see your machines in the top left and you can access your machines that way. And then I like working through my Windows machine. So if I access my Windows machine, you can click on it, go to console to access it, or you can click this console in the upper right, and that's going to give you a little pop-out. The first time you're signing in, to enter Control-Alt-Delete, you have to click this like Show Extra Keys button and click this Send Control-Alt-Delete. This is also all going to be in the video if you ever forget. Then from there, you would sign in, and you'd have to change the password for the administrator account. It'll ask you to do that. It'll say like, enter the password for the administrator account, then you'll be signed in. Okay. So for the VPN people, now that we talked about setting up your machines, how do you actually access the environment? Well, you download this purpleteam.o VPN file, and in Windows, you're going to use OpenVPN Connect. So if you don't have the OpenVPN Connect client, that's another thing you're going to have to just download. You can look up OpenVPN Connect and just download it. From your Kali, if you used my setup script though, it will automatically be installed on your Windows machine because I have it baked into that setup script. So it should already be there. I did have some issues with it working though. So if it's not there.
So I have to create a shared network.
No, if you don't have OpenVPN, you do have OpenVPN.
Yeah, I do have OpenVPN. When I tried,
that's all you need.
But Purple Team VPN file did not set it up on its own in the device. So I had to download it on my base operating system and using the shared network app.
Yes, you will have to like grab the Purple Team VPN file and download it to your Windows machine, which you can either do with like shared files, or you can just like directly go to Discord in your virtual machine, right?
The easiest for me is just put it on my GitHub.
Or you could do that if you want to do that.
I'm trying to access the
This
Kali
is for
admin.
my easiest.
This is default.
The credentials for Kali are going to be Kali Kali,
Oh, sorry.
Kali.
Not admin.
Yeah. And use yes. So for the VPN, you will have to download this file and download it to the actual Windows machine that you're connecting with, right? Or the Kali machine that you're connecting with, right? And then in Windows, you would open OpenVPN Connect, which I already have installed. If you used my setup script, OpenVPN will be on your desktop, so you don't have to worry about it. And then from here, I'm just going to delete this so I show this from scratch. I would click on Upload File, Browse, and then just choose my Purple Team file, and then I can click Connect. And then it might take a little bit, but it should eventually connect me to the VPN, right? On Linux, it's a lot easier. You just install the OpenVPN package if you don't already have it, but on Kali Linux, it's installed by default. You can use like a package manager like apt-yum. You can say apt install OpenVPN. It's that straightforward. And then from here, you use sudo OpenVPN and then the name of the file. And you have to leave that running in a terminal session, and that will connect you to the VPN on your Linux machine. Make sense?
So this VPN is for accessing the machines that we have created.
Yes. So if you chose option 2, which is to access them in a web browser, you do not have to worry about this. But if you chose option 1, which is to set up the machines yourself, you need a way of accessing the network. And so this is to access the network that way.
So I have my Kali Linux and Kali Linux with it in a VM Revolution. I'm on a Mac, so now I have to download the VPN to access connected network.
Yes, correct. Yes, and you would upload this file to your virtual machines, however you want to do that. And then, yes, you can follow this methodology to do that. So on Windows, OpenVPN Connect, and on Linux, this command.
But I don't have the file.
The file is right here, the OpenVPN file. It's at the bottom of the message.
I found this open in my cyber Discord.
Let me see if you're added here.
Actually, DM'd you, and my name is Ramya.
Yeah, I remember you DMing me, but did I not?
Yeah, I texted you like I missed the last session and I was trying to.
Oh, that's fine. What's your Discord again?
Ramya 0507.
This one?
Yeah.
Cool. Now you have access to this one, and you're also going to need access to this one. I don't know, did I send you credentials? No, I didn't. But you have machines that set up on your end that you can use for now, right?
I have Kali Linux.
Okay. That should be fine. We're not even going to be using them this time around. We'll be using them next time. So, yeah.
The credentials for the
Kali ain't working for him. It might work for me.
I might have. I was fat fingering it because I was setting yours up so last minute that I might have actually done it wrong. So give me a second. Or not create invite. Send messages. Boom. Okay. Do. So for you, I'm going to shut down your machine for a second. So my apologies. Then we go to Cloud Init and okay, let's try it now. I'm restarting it, so it'll take a little bit to boot up, but now Kali should work. Okay. So, let's say we have access to our Windows machine. This is my preferred way of accessing the Kali machine from the Windows machine. So I'm going to open two things. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open a command prompt. And just to make it a little prettier, I'll maximize it, and I can right click. This is all optional. Like if you miss this, don't worry about it. But I just like to make the text a little bigger. So I can right click, properties, and then it might take a little bit to pop up, but it should pop up. And then we go to font. And then we can make the size bigger. So I like to do 28, for example.
The network that you were setting, right?
Mhm.
In that network, was it for those with VPN or for us?
For the VPN people.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe we should-
All the networking stuff that I
Yeah.
just talked about was for VPN people, yes. And then you can also go to right-click properties, right-click defaults, and this will set it so that every time you open it, the font's going to be larger. So just like some quality of life things that I like to do. The first thing we're going to need to know is our IP address. So if I say ipconfig,
Shows the IP address.
this is the IP address of your Windows machine. Your Linux machine is the same IP, but with a 1 at the end. So it'll be 172.16.70.11 in my case, right? So just keep that in mind. That's going to be your Kali machine. Also, this is a good test for people using the VPN. Just to make sure you do, in fact, have access to the network, you can always try to ping 192.168.10.10. That is the Seven Kingdoms.local machine. If you go back to our environment info in the Discord, like I have the IPs listed out there. But this machine should be pingable from the VPN if you're connected, right? And then the other thing you can try doing is pinging sevenkingdoms.local. And that's the same machine, but this just proves that DNS resolution is set correctly and working correctly. So as long as you can ping those two, you should be good. If you have issues, you might have to look into whether, if this one didn't work, then there's an issue with the VPN. If this one didn't work, there's an issue with DNS, and you might have to custom set the DNS server, which is 172.16.71. Well, actually, not in the VPN case. Anyway, if you need that, ask me. But hopefully it just works.
Could we use a public DNS server?
You can, but then you won't be able to access wazuh.cyberhawks.lab in a web browser. Because I set up custom records for Wazuh so that we can just access it in a web browser without having to type in its IP address.
Okay.
And if you don't use my DNS server, then you won't be able to resolve that. Yeah, but you can still access it via its IP. That's so up to you. But for ease of use, it makes sense to use. Okay, cool. So then from here, now that we know our IP and we know our Kali's IP, which is the same thing plus 1 because that's how I have it set up. Now we can open MOBA Xterm. MOBA Xterm will take a little bit to start up because it's a little bit of a bigger application.
I wanted to ask, on the command prompt, could you just SSH and Kali out?
Yes. You absolutely could just SSH into the Kali machine. The reason I use MOBA Xterm, which I'll show you in a second, is because, first of all, it saves the session for you. So the next time you open it up, you'll just double click and it'll just create the session. It's really easy. And then the second reason I use it is because it lets you really easily upload and download files too. On the left-hand side, it has a file explorer, and you can transfer files back and forth between machines. So it just makes it easier. But yes, absolutely, you could, if you wanted to, you could just use SSH in your command prompt directly. But anyway, if you're doing the MOBA Xterm route in MOBA Xterm, we'll click Session to create a new session. And then SSH, because this is an SSH session. And then the machine we're connecting to, which is 172.16.70.11 in my case, but remember that last number will be different in your case, right? And then I'll say specify username Kali. And then we'll connect. And hopefully, I was actually messing with routing stuff for my thing specifically. So if it doesn't work for me, it should still work for you. But it actually did work for me. It looks like it's just being slow. That's okay. So then it should connect to your Linux machine. And then here, eventually, we're going to have a terminal. And on the left-hand side, you can see you can view the files on your Linux machine, right? And so if you want to download a file, you can just like click on the file and click this download button, and that makes it easy to download a file. Or you can upload a file from your Windows machine by clicking on the upload button. And then that'll give you access to your Windows machine files. It is being a little slow, which is kind of sad, but that's okay. Yes, and it says choose which files to upload. Cool. And then here you can see I have a terminal to my Kali machine. So this is just to keep everything in one place. All right. Now we're putting a pin on that, so to speak, until next week when we're actually running attacks. But now you have access to your attacking machines. So you can already, if you want to, start playing around with the environment. You're more than welcome to. You do have the network information, but again, no obligation, right? Like we're going to officially start the attack portion of things next week. But if I go back to Wazuh, you can see if we go back to the environment info here, like this is the Active Directory network, this is the services network, and you're welcome to start poking around and seeing what's there. Okay. I'm actually going to do the rest of this through the VPN, just to kind of like both showcase both options, and also because then like I can actually copy and paste with my host machine, and it's nicer that way. But anyway, so now that I'm connected to my VPN, or if you're in the Proxmox environment, you will already have access to this. You don't need to connect with a VPN. If you open up a web browser like Microsoft Edge, or in my case, I'm using Vivaldi or Google Chrome, whatever you want to use, you can go to https://wazuh.cyberhawks.lab. If you ever forget that, it's in two different places. It's in those credentials that I sent you. If you open that link, it also shows you where those credentials apply, and it'll say wazuh.cyberhawks.lab. The second place, if you ever forget, is in our in pinned messages in environment info. It's right at the top. Wazuh is at wazuh.cyberhawks.lab. Anyway, when I navigate there, I also don't know how Wazuh is going to hold up with all of us trying to access it at once, but it should be fine. The first time you access it, it won't automatically log you in. The only reason it logged me in is because I logged in before, but you'll then enter the credentials that I sent to you. Who was having trouble with credentials? You.
Everyone. I tried to access my credentials, but it did not work for me as well.
Yeah, there was a portal? It worked.
No.
For Wazuh?
Oh, I didn't.
Proxmox?
Well, I didn't create credentials for you in Proxmox because you're using the VPN option. But you, for Wazuh, you're having trouble accessing Wazuh?
I had trouble accessing. I didn't try Wazuh, but I tried.
Okay. I should mention anybody who put that they'd be okay with using the VPN.
Okay.
I gave you the VPN because I want to like limit how many people are like using the server. So yes, my apologies. I should have been.
I did set up using all the scripts.
Nice.
Yeah.
And for now, like if you don't have your attacking machines for this session, that's totally okay. If you're using the VPN option, you can just follow along like on your host machine. Like if you have Linux, you could just run OpenVPN. If you have Windows, you do have to download OpenVPN Connect, but it's a very small download and you can just connect.
When you open the mobile tab,
MOBA Xterm, yeah.
what do we click on? There's a menu bar.
So, show me what you're referring to because I'm not entirely sure. Oh, you're good. You can just click on session, and then you can click SSH, and there you would type in the IP address of your Kali machine. Yes.
Okay. You need patience. You need patience. You need patience. It takes a sweet time.
It's pretty much the same issue.
So I set up everything on my own version. I wanted to use your script for Oh My Kali. How's it? Like,
Oh, that was I created that a long time ago, but yeah, sure.
directly run it.
Yeah, definitely.
Git clone. That's it.
Yeah. If you use Oh My Z shell or Oh My ZSH, I have a separate command versus if you just don't use that. And if you just want to install it, I have a separate command. But they're both on there. And you can just copy paste. And that sets it up.
I wanted to ask you before.
Yeah. No, yeah, you can safely just run that. The only thing that does is it modifies your ZSHRC file so that like it loads in special aliases that I like to use, which is basically commands, but you can type them easier, right? And it just like adds it to ZSHRC, right?
It is integrated with PimpMyKali, right?
So it's actually separate from PimpMyKali. I just named it OhMyKali because it's OhMyZShell and PimpMyKali. So, but yeah, it is separate. But I like both of them, so that's why I said in the GitHub repo, I'm like, you should use PimpMyKali and OhMyKali. But
Yeah, I read it yesterday.
yeah, nice. But honestly, I haven't used that in a while. But okay, so now let's talk a little bit about Wazuh. I'm going to show you a little bit of background on installation and setup. This is going to be a not follow along section. I'll just show you how I set it up because this is already set up for you, so you don't have to set it up. But in case somebody does want to use Wazuh themselves, I want to like be clear with you how I set it up, right? So, like I mentioned before, if we go to pinned messages and we go to resources, all of the resources that I used for setting it up are here, so you can access them. This first one is actually one I created. So if we go here, I had to deploy Wazuh agents on multiple machines in the environment, right? And it would take time to go to each machine individually and like run all the commands to deploy it. So I needed a way to script that out so I can run it on multiple machines. Ansible is one very popular automation framework that you can use to run commands on multiple machines, right? So that's what I did here. I created Ansible scripts to install what needs to be installed, right? So with Ansible, you can organize things into roles that each do a different thing, right? And then you'll create what's called a playbook, and that playbook will just pull from the roles and run all those commands.
On different machines.
Yes, on all the machines that you want to set up, basically. So actually, I have this, and this repo is publicly accessible. Again, it's under Wazuh setup. It's the first link there, if you wanted to check it out further. So you'll notice that we have this inventory file, and this defines the machines that we want to actually add, that we want to perform these changes on. So here I have like all the listed machines for the Game of Active Directory environment. You can see I do it by machine name, and then we tell it the IP address where it says Ansible host equals. That's its IP address, right? So that's how Ansible knows which machines to reach out to and what credentials to use. And then from there, I created a bunch of different roles for installing different things. So let's talk about the different things that I installed. Most rudimentary, we need the actual Wazuh agent itself that's going to take the logs from that machine and forward it to our Wazuh server. So I have a Wazuh Linux role that does it for the Linux machines and the Wazuh Windows role that does it for the Windows machines. If you're curious how to do that without using a script like this, if you're curious how to actually do it yourself, Wazuh has awesome documentation. So if you just look up Wazuh documentation and go to their documentation, you'll see this beautiful like installation guide here, and you can just like go and look at Wazuh agent, and it'll explain how do we install the Wazuh agent in Linux, in Windows, in Mac, in Oracle, whatever operating system you want to install it on, right? So in Linux, you basically have to download their apt or yum package, right? And then from there specify some options that define like what the IP address of the server or manager that you're connecting it to. And it's really that straightforward, and that's it, and it's installed. So if you look at what my script does here, and I'm not going to go through all of them this in depth, but just to show you, if you look at my Ansible role here, you can see it uses apt to install the Wazuh agent, right? And then it basically starts the Wazuh agent service with systemd. Yeah, systemctl, right, is what it's actually using. But yeah. Then, so we have that for Linux and we have that for Windows. On Windows, it's also relatively straightforward. It's you download this installer, so there's a .msi package for Windows, and you change different like options that you run it with depending on how you want to set it up. So for example, like I could specify my manager IP address in there, and then it'll know what's the IP address of my actual manager or server machine that it has to connect to, right? So very similar to Linux, using package, or either an MSI package on Windows or your apt-yum package in Linux. Cool. From there, I installed something called sysmon. Windows, by default, like we talked about last time, actually we did talk about this last time. So if you remember, we have our normal Windows events that log the things that happen on our Windows machine. And we also have sysmon, which is kind of this additional extension that you can install into Windows that helps audit certain things that would be maybe more relevant to looking for evidence of an attack, right? So it'll monitor like process creation, file changes, right? Now that's also pretty straightforward to install. Again, it's a executable that you run. But you have to specify a configuration for it to use. And that configuration tells it what files, things to monitor. So I'm using a very popular configuration. Or this is the wrong repo. I have too many things open. Okay. If you go to the Swift on security sysmon config, like if you just look up sysmon configuration, and you'll see this, right? And this is like the first Google search result that comes up. And this is just a configuration that somebody else already put together that takes like common Windows things and makes sure that it monitors for those common Windows things, right? So I just grabbed this configuration as is and used this one. So that's the second thing that we're doing here. The third thing is we have to explicitly declare that we want to forward Microsoft Windows Defender logs to Wazuh, because by default it doesn't. So here, this role actually forwards Defender logs to Wazuh. So what it does here is it just modifies. I'll show you everything is defined in this configuration file. I'll show you that later on. But that's what this role is doing for now. And then we also enabled PowerShell logging. So PowerShell logging is an optional feature in Windows that actually logs all of the commands that people are running in PowerShell, which is really useful because red teamers or attackers or offensive security people, they like to use PowerShell tradecraft, or they like to use PowerShell commandlets to run things, like all the AD PowerShell that we were doing, right? So PowerShell logging will log all of those PowerShell commands. And then for Linux, not as many fun things that we can set up in Linux as in Windows, but we have auditd, which is a package in Linux that essentially does kind of what an EDR would do. You can monitor specific system calls. You can monitor file changes and directory changes. There's a lot of things you can do with auditd, but I just set it up to monitor the execve system call, which is basically the underlying function that gets run whenever you execute a command. That's a lot of words, but essentially what it does is the same thing as PowerShell logging, but for Linux, right? So in the end, we're going to see all the commands that anybody on the Linux machine runs.
I have a great idea to secure my PrestaShop.
Yes, and actually I was talking about this with Kat. I'm like, hey, you should use auditd to monitor for changes to files in the PrestaShop directory. And Kat's like, oh, I already do that. So it's cool.
We did that.
Maybe
Yeah.
we could do the PowerShell logging as well.
You could do PowerShell logging in Windows. Now, are we actually going to jump on the Windows machine and run PowerShell commands? I mean, maybe. I'm not saying what we aren't doing, but think about.
I saw it.
You have to think about how realistic that is. Remember, we're mostly probably going to be relying on beacons, which function differently. They don't necessarily run PowerShell. But yeah, it's an option. Okay, so Okay, so we used these scripts to install the agent on all the machines. We also have a couple special machines like the firewall and the intrusion detection system, which is Suricata, right? So I linked resources that I used to install it on those here. So, and honestly, I just found these by Googling. So I Googled like pfSense Wazuh, and I found this resource, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. And I followed these instructions to set it up, to set up my firewall logs. And then I followed these instructions, which are in the official Wazuh documentation, on configuring it to grab Suricata logs. Actually, there's an error if you just set it up the default way they tell you. You get an error, not this one actually, but a different one that says like, oh, too many fields from the log. And that took a lot of like Googling and bashing my head until I figured it out. But I figured it out. I don't know why they don't have it in their documentation, but I figured it out that if you get that error, you can just add this line to that file on the server and that fixes it. And the reason it does that is because like it changes the amount of the size of the logs that it is willing to ingest, right? So Suricata logs, I believe, this is where I could be saying it wrong, but I think the Suricata logs are like too long or too big by default. So you have to like increase the actual log size that it's ingesting.
We do not have to set up Wazuh, right? On our
I already set up all of this for you. I just want to tell you so that in case like you're interested in how this works and how to set it up on your end, and it's like relevant. So yes, this is Wazuh specific, but if you're setting up, for example, Splunk, you're going to have to take a similar process where you install agents, right, on each of the machines, or forwarders, they're called in Splunk. And if you want to set up some of the stuff that I set up, like you're going to have to set up Sysmon, you're going to have to set up PowerShell logging, right? All of this stuff still applies, even if you're not using Wazuh. But yes, this is all set up for you. And then the last piece is, how did I integrate Wazuh with Discord? Well, here's the site that I used to... There's a few different sites that give you instructions for integrating Wazuh with Discord. I consulted a bunch of them, and I liked this one the best, because other sites, they like wrote their own script for doing it. This one, they actually took the script that Wazuh gives you for Slack, and they just like modified it to work with Wazuh. And I like that better, because then if Wazuh makes any updates to the Slack script, like I trust the Slack script because it came directly from the people who developed Wazuh, right? So I prefer to just modify that existing script rather than using somebody else's like fully custom script. Anyway, I followed these instructions, and in here they told you to make the like alert level 7. But because of, I was kind of looking at some of the alerts that I was getting, and I was getting a lot of them that were greater than 7. So I chose 12 and up. And we'll talk about alert levels a little bit later on. But that's just the one difference there. Okay. So now we talked about setting up Wazuh, at least the general idea. Now let's talk about how to actually use Wazuh. All right. So, and I'm going to close some of these many things I have open so the tabs don't confuse me. Okay. Wazuh is an open source SIM. So if you were ever interested in the source code for Wazuh, the source code is on this GitHub here. The other nice thing about having the source code here is you can, like, if you don't want to go into the files to actually look at the rules, you can actually see all the rules here if you go to rule set, this rule set directory. And then here are the decoders, which we'll talk about what that means in a bit. And then here are the rules. And so I can actually dig into each of these rules. So if I'm interested in like Suricata rules, I can just search for Suricata. And here I have all of the Suricata rules, right? So really nice reference to have. Then if you're interested in what can you do with Wazuh, there's this really awesome capabilities page on their documentation that tells you all the different things that you can do with Wazuh. So one of the things you can do is you can monitor for changes to a file. So if you have a like a configuration file that's supposed to stay the same, like it doesn't change, but an attacker might want to modify it to like change how your system behaves, you can actually monitor that file and see if there are any changes and get alerted on that, right? And that's where we were talking about, like in CCDC with PrestaShop, which is a website that they have to defend in CCDC, to make sure that those website files aren't actually changing. So one thing you could do is you could actually monitor those files and see if they get changed, right? And if they do, you know it's probably an attacker who's doing it. It also does malware detection. I haven't dug into this one too much yet, but you can kind of use it like a antivirus, where you give it like Yara rules, like you would a antivirus, and it can flag based on that. I'm actually not using it for I'm not using it for malware detection here, because I'm doing this option down here, which is to use Windows Defender for malware detection and forward the logs to Wazuh. You can also do security configuration assessment. So the neat thing about Wazuh, and that's why they call it like an extended detection response system, because this sets it apart from other SIMs, is you can actually look at the state of, it monitors not only those logs, but also the state of your machine and the versions of the services that you're running. And so it can potentially look for outdated service versions or misconfigurations. And you can, and you can basically fix it based on that. So if we go to security operations, for example, we have a bunch of different compliance frameworks that companies would have to meet, like PCI DSS. And if we click on that, you actually get like an overview of how your machines currently meet those compliance regulations and any configuration changes you might have to make to them to meet those compliance regulations. So that's another thing Wazuh can do. I'm going to skip active response because I feel like it makes more sense to talk about that. And this also kind of goes into system inventory, right? Like you can also see the processes, files. So if we actually want to investigate an agent here in Wazuh, if I go to my overview tab, I can see my active agents here. So if I click on active, here I see my agents. And if I want to see information about an agent, I can click, for example, DCO2 as a domain controller. And then from here, this brings up all these options like malware detection or file integrity monitoring or configuration assessment, right? And so here's that configuration assessment that you can make it like try to meet some sort of benchmark or some sort of compliance requirement and see how close it is to meeting that benchmark. So if you're familiar with CIS, the CIS benchmark is like this a recommended guide for how to harden different machines. So they have like a list of configuration changes that you should make to that machine to consider it like production ready. And so here it's actually telling you like which checks for this specific machine it passed and which checks it failed, right? Okay. Monitoring system calls, kind of a misnomer because Wazuh actually doesn't monitor system calls. This section talks about setting up audit D to monitor system calls, which I did set up to monitor the execv system call, right? But there is like a whole section explaining how to do it here. And then the things that, so those are all the different things that Wazuh is capable of, but how about the things that we're actually going to be using it for? We're going to be using it for vulnerability detection, log collection, first of all. You kind of already saw we were forwarding logs to it. Vulnerability detection, so we're going to be hunting for vulnerabilities. And maybe we might get into active response. So you can even set up like automated active response procedures in Wazuh to make it like make changes on machines depending on like if it receives a specific kind of alert.
What is it good with false positives?
Yes, so you do have to be careful, right, with active response. You have to be careful with false positives because if you have an active response and it turns out it wasn't an attacker, that's bad if you respond to that. So in most cases, like you would probably set up alerts that then somebody manually would investigate and then choose to respond to it, right? But maybe there are very specific things that you know your users are for sure not going to be doing. So if it happens, it's definitely an attacker. Like that file, like modifying a configuration file like we talked about before, like that's not something a user is going to be doing. So maybe you want to set up an automatic response that if it's modified, like it kicks that user off. And that's something you can do in Wazuh, I think. I haven't played around with that part of it too much yet. But let's talk about the different aspects of the Wazuh dashboard. Actually, before we do that, oh man, I'm sorry that this is like so much background information, but you know, it's all part of this ecosystem that is Wazuh. But on your individual machines, so if I go to, and you don't have access to this, don't worry about it. This is just like a watch and learn kind of thing. If I go to one of these machines, so let's see if I can access it from my, it's going to be small, I apologize, but small text, maybe if I open it like this, I can make it a little bit bigger at least. Okay, cool, that's readable. So if I log into one of the machines that I installed an agent on, right? So this is one of the machines that we're monitoring. It's called Web. I'll just log in with my manager credentials. And you can see if I do system control status Wazuh agent, this is the actual service that is sending those logs to the Wazuh server, right? Yeah. Now, how is this configured? I'm actually going to switch to root because it's just easier for me to do everything as root. This is a bad security practice, just letting you know, so do not take example from this, but just for demonstration's sake. Oh my gosh, if I could enter my password correctly, that would be helpful. Okay, cool. All of the configuration for Wazuh, for the server, for the indexer, for the dashboard, for the agent, every virtual machine that has anything Wazuh related, it is all in one folder, and that is var ossec. And if I list the files in this folder, you can see I have the configuration for Wazuh, for the Wazuh agent on this endpoint or on this machine specifically, right? Yeah. So there's one main, it's kind of laid out like a Linux file system is normally laid out. Like you have the etc directory that's probably going to have configuration files. So if we go to the etc directory, we have this ossec.conf file. And this file is very important because it defines what logs we want to forward from this machine to Wazuh. So if I print out ossec.conf, right? Here are all the logs that I'm forwarding from this machine to Wazuh. So as you can see, we have like the regular syslog, we have Apache logs because this is a web server. Mm-hmm. And it actually noticed that Apache was installed and added these. Like I didn't have to manually add these. So that's a cool thing Wazuh did there. And the one I manually added was our audit D log, right, for those commands, right? So this defines all our logs. And I mean, if I take a closer look at the beginning of this file, you can see here's where we have the configuration for like what the actual IP address of the manager is, right? Or manager server, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably, but that server manager machine, its IP address, how it's connecting to it on TCP port 1514, right? That kind of stuff. It's all in this one configuration file. The other thing that that is relatively important is we have certain options are in this internal options.conf file. So if I'm more internal options.conf, these also change how the Wazuh agent behaves, right? So whereas ossec.conf had our like main configurations and our interfacing with Wazuh, this has like specific things that can change the way that the service itself behaves. One of the things that's kind of interesting here is the Wazuh commands option. So the neat thing is all of these, I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to see, but all of these configuration files, you can actually change remotely in the Wazuh dashboard, which is why I'm not giving you access to any of these machines because you don't need it. You can make changes to all the configurations directly in the Wazuh dashboard. But in order to set that up, you have to enable what's called remote commands in Wazuh, and that allows the Wazuh server to actually access each of the individual machines and make changes to the configuration. So that's one configuration option in this file that becomes relevant. Now, the interesting thing about this internal options.conf file is it gets overwritten whenever Wazuh is updated. So if Wazuh makes like a change to the options that they offer, they will overwrite it here. So there's a separate local internal options.conf file, which is where you are intended to put your options that you want to set. So there might be a default remote commands option in internal options, but if you want to override that, you would do that in local internal options. And then if you get an update, that update will like modify the internal options.conf file, but it won't modify your local internal options.conf file, so your changes stay.
Thank you. That's what I did wrong. I was just something else.
So as you can see, I added Wazuh. I set remote commands to 1 in this local options file so that we can modify Wazuh configuration from directly in our dashboard. Cool. The other, I'm still like learning what all these files do, but the other directory that's really important is your logs directory, right? So if we go to var ossec logs, now I just want to be clear here that these are not the actual logs from your machine that are being forwarded to Wazuh, right? Those have their own log locations that are defined in the configuration file that I showed you before. But this file will log like how the agent is doing and any errors that it encounters. So if you're trying to like start up the Wazuh agent and it encounters an error, you can check the ossec.log file. So if I just tail to get the end of this file, you can see I just have a bunch of info like started evaluation, finished evaluation because it's working. But if you saw errors, those errors would pop up here. And the active response log, by the way, when we get to active response, that logs, you can choose like what kinds of information to save in the logs for when you perform automated response, right? And that's going to be saved into that active response log file there. Cool. I'm not going to showcase Windows because it's actually really similar in how it's set up. The only difference is it uses like a more Windows-like file system than Linux-like. So rather than having an etc directory, the ossec.conf file is directly like in the main directory for Wazuh. And it also has a logs directory. So that part's the same. The only thing you need to know is for Windows, by default, the path that it's installed in is C program files ossec-agent. Or sorry, C program files x86. C program files x86 ossec-agent. Right. And then those you don't need to know this because I already set it up for you. But C program files ossec, so same as here, -agent, agent, if you're curious. And that's going to have pretty much the same files that you see here. So I'm not going to go over it again, but they're organized a little bit differently because they're organized in a more Windows-y way. So there's no like etc directory. The ossec.conf file is just like right there. But if you know the files in Linux, in Windows, they're pretty much the same.
What's the absolute?
For the ossec file?
So I'm just going to write this down because it'll be easier that way. Oh no, I'm exposing an API key. I'll have to edit that out of the video. That's okay. So in Linux, it's var ossec. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting now.
It's etc.
It's var
No.
ossec, local internal.
No, I think it's just var ossec, right?
Yeah, but then we ls and went to the etc file.
We did go to the, so within ossec, there's like the etc for configuration, there's logs for logs, right? But the main directory is var ossec. In Windows, it's C program files x86 ossec agent. That's the directory in Windows. And all of this is in their documentation too. So if you ever forget and you want to learn, like you go install Like you go to the Wazuh documentation. Also, why do I have so many things open? Don't need you. Don't need you. Okay. Going back to Wazuh, if I go to their documentation and I go to like installing an agent, right? Wazuh agent. I don't know if it says it here, but if I go to like try to install it on Linux, right? It'll be like, maybe it's not exactly here. I forget exactly where it is, but it's somewhere in the documentation for sure. User manual, maybe. Agent, user manual, agent enrollment. Yeah, I'm sure it's here. But anyway, you have it. Cool. So now that we talked about, and I should mention the actual Wazuh. So I showed you an example of a Wazuh agent being installed, but the Wazuh server and indexer and dashboard all set up the same way, right? So they're running, in my case, I'm running Debian, I believe, as the underlying operating system. But even in the server, I can go to, and you can ignore all the things I have open here. But if I open up the server and make it a little bit bigger, I can go to var OSSec, and it has all of the relevant stuff. There are some things specifically with the server that I want to talk about because they're a little different and interesting. So remember, the server actually is the one that originally gets all your logs and then matches them to different decoders, which I'll talk about in a second, and rules, right? So your server is the one that matches logs to rules and alerts. So the actual rules are in kind of two places. So the main rules that ship with Wazuh are in this var OSSec rule set. And I showed you how I could also access that on their GitHub, right? So I also went to rule set in their GitHub and I could see it that way too. But they're all stored locally on this machine. So whoops, I didn't mean to do ... I'm like talking and thinking at the same time and it's messing me up. So here you can see we have decoders and we have rules. If I go to rules, here are all the stock rule files that ship with Wazuh. If we want to create our own custom rule files, that's within the etc directory, I think. I'm kind of guessing here, but I think I'm right. etc rules. So any custom rules that you define, which we are going to be defining custom rules, they'd be put in etc rules. And as you may have noticed, this also has an ossec.conf file for general configuration, and it has your internal options and your local internal options, just like all of our agents do. So all of it is very similarly structured, which is nice. And the other thing, the last thing that I want to talk about, I swear, before we start doing fun stuff, is integrations. So there are a couple of ways of actually integrating Wazuh with Discord. But the way that I did it is by using an official like Wazuh integration. So if you go to integrations, integrations are basically ways to visualize alerts or data on other platforms. So let's say you wanted to upload or you wanted to show alerts in Slack, right? You have a Slack option. So what I did is I basically copied the Slack files and renamed them to custom Discord. If you want to create your own custom integration, it has to be named custom dash at the beginning. But anyway, so I have that. It's basically just a copy of those with some modifications. So if you look at this custom discord.py, this is for you programmer people out there. The actual part that I changed, most of it is left the same. But the part that I changed here is this generate message function. And then I just added some logic for color coding the rules and giving it a severity because it was just to make it pretty because we can. And then from here, we're like basically building out an API request, right? And then from here, we just send the API request to Discord. And the actual like link to the Discord webhook is in the ossec.conf file. So all of the actual code behind building that request is here in integrations. But if we go to our etc Is it ossec.conf? But the actual like definition, like where we actually define that we want to have this integration, is here in our ossec.conf file, and there you can see the actual webhook, which I will also redact from the video because I should not be exposing that because that allows you to send messages in the Wazuh channel. But that's okay. Cool. So now I feel like we have a strong enough understanding of how Wazuh is set up, how it's configured, and how everything works. Really quickly, each of those components that I showed you, so for example, our server, if we want to manage our server, we can also do that in the dashboard on the left-hand side here. And so all of those settings that I showed you before, if we go to settings, and ideally something should not go wrong. I might just have to revisit the page because I've been going back and forth. Okay, there we go. So if we go to settings, all those settings that you could see in that ossec.conf file, they're also here. So the global configuration, I can click it, I can view it, and I can directly make changes here if I wanted to, right? I actually don't think I set that up for the server specifically. I didn't set up Wazuh commands or remote commands like I talked about before, but I did for all the agents. But anyway, normally, like if you set that up, you can make changes here too. The actual, so this becomes more relevant. There's a similar page for each of the agents. So if we go to agents management and we go to summary, here you can see a list of all of the agents. I'm saying agents is basically the machines that we're monitoring, right? I'm calling them agents because the Wazuh name for them is agents. So all the machines on the network that we're monitoring, agents. But if I click on an individual agent, I'm forgetting where this is. I think it's in configuration in the top right. I get the same thing. And here, the neat thing about this is if I go to log collection, I can see all of the logs that are being collected from this specific agent. So in this case, there's not too many like interesting logs, but if I go to Windows events, you can see I'm collecting sysmon events, I'm collecting PowerShell for PowerShell logging, and I'm collecting the Windows Defender events, right? And then if I go to like a Linux machine, like this one, and I go to configuration and log collection. And the thing with Wazuh is like sometimes it just decides to be slow randomly and I have to just like click out, click again. So if anything's like taking forever to load, just like click out of it and click back into it again. But here we can see more logs like the Apache 2. Sorry, I say Apache, but I guess Apache logs here, right? And then here we have journal D logs. And it's also actually by default set up to monitor for certain commands being executed. Or actually, I don't think this monitors for certain commands being executed. I think this actually executes these commands on an interval and gets the results. So then we can actually see if we look at this endpoint and we want to learn more about it. I'm forgetting how to do this now. We can actually see... yeah, not important. There is a way to like see the processes that are running and see that kind of stuff, but I'm forgetting where it is off the top of my head. It's somewhere here. Boop, 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 boop. Maybe I don't have to be in the, maybe I'm not supposed to be in the configuration thing, but maybe I'm supposed to be in the actual like, okay. This is going to bug me now, but you're just going to have to trust me that there's a way to see all the information about it. Anyway, whatever. That's not the, or maybe it's inventory data. Is that it? Yeah, here we go. Okay. So here, if you click on inventory data, you can see like the software that's installed. You can see the network connections that it's making. So really useful if you're a defender and you want to triage like what's going on. And then you can see like a list of processes. And it might take a bit to load because it has to actually pull it from the agent itself. But I believe those commands that we saw earlier are the commands that it's using to pull some of this information. Anyway.
John,
Mm-hmm.
just could you go over how the injector was set up? What's the score?
How the indexer was set up?
Yeah, 'cause it
Okay.
takes, like,
Sure. So, the indexer basically makes it so that, okay, so the server collects our logs into one spot, right? Now, the indexer indexes our logs or essentially sorts them so that when we search them, it's faster, right? So, the indexer takes the logs from the server, it sorts them, and keeps track of them. And then when we actually run, I'll show you this in a second, but when we actually go to a dashboard and we try to perform searches, the indexer is the one that's going to be performing those searches. Now, to set that up, it's actually really straightforward. And that's why I didn't show it, because like there's nothing special with that one. But if you go to the installation guide, there you can do it fully manually, and they give you like instructions for how to do that, or you can do the assisted installation, which is what I did. And then it was literally just running a command. It was like Wazuh install, and then specify the name of the dashboard. And then it was set up, and that was it. So when you're actually installing Wazuh for the first time, when you're installing your indexer and your server and your dashboard, all that good stuff, you start with the indexer, you follow this assisted installation guide, and all you have to do is you have to like change some configuration options to like define how many indexers, how many servers you want to have. In my case, we just have one, but you could even have like a cluster of them, a whole thing. You would define that in this configuration file. And then from there, you just run the commands and it sets it up for you from that configuration file. So it's really straightforward. Like if you go to do it yourself and you have trouble, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. But I honestly just followed these instructions, did not have to consult any outside resources. And these instructions just made perfect sense. So, yeah. Okay,
Side note, I just want to say something.
go for it.
I didn't realize you were a Game of Thrones fan.
So actually, Game of Active Directory is based on Game of Thrones. That's why it's called Game of Active Directory, because it's Game of Thrones themed. So I did not create that environment, they did. So whoever created Goat is a Game of Thrones fan. Yes, everything in that environment is Game of Thrones themed, including the users, and it's fun. It's cool.
That should be
Love
fun. GOT. That should
Yeah.
be fun.
Did you watch it?
Of course.
I do love
Who
Game of
didn't
Thrones,
watch Game
though.
of Thrones?
Although I only got through like 4 seasons.
Why? You couldn't?
I didn't do all however many there are now. There are quite a few. Yeah. Anyway.
Don't watch the last one. I was that's
Yeah, this
pretty much about it.
it just went like this.
That's what I hear from a lot of people. Anyway, let's start. Now that you have all of the background, also, if anybody needs to leave at any point, you do not have to. You can leave. It's okay, because I can keep going all night. I'm not going to keep going all night, but if you need to leave, that's okay. I'm gonna try to like finish up at 11.
Okay.
So we'll see how that goes.
Credentials. I did not get the credentials for that server.
Yes, I do not have. I unfortunately do not have the time to set up like a whole other server instance now. For now, just use the VPN. But I will send you credentials for the. And I need to make credentials for Wazuh too. I know. I will get to that, but I already like at the very beginning. I already realized it takes me 15 minutes to set it up, so I don't want to like do it. So for now, watch, but you'll have the recording. You can always follow along later. Yes. I will not forget. Yes. So, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be using Wazuh for. Oh, sorry. Actually, no. Yes, this is what I'm going to do. Okay. So, under threat, so there are kind of 2 ways to visualize Wazuh data. You can use this Discover dashboard here, or you can use the threat hunting dashboard under threat intelligence. I have tried both and I prefer each of them for different things, but like they're very similar. There's just like some minor differences between them, but I'll show you both. We'll start with the threat hunting dashboard, which I believe was there first. If we go to threat hunting, right now you can see like I'm specifically targeting web here, but if I just wanted to see all of the events in general, not just targeting web, I can unpin the agent here. So if you pin a specific agent, like then it'll only show you the logs for that agent. But if you unpin it, then you see all the logs for everything, right? And then here we have a dashboard where we can like see general information about the logs that we're getting. But if we go to events, this is where we can drill into specific events and actually perform our searches, right? So how do we search for things in Wazuh? Actually, okay, let me talk about the other way of viewing logs too. So this is one way of doing it, right? And then you can either like put queries in this search field here, right? Like you can search for a specific rule ID. So if I search for rule ID 92213, like you see I did here, I do that, it pulls back all of the rule IDs 92213. Another thing I could do is I could actually filter by creating, I can click add filter, and I could also do it this way. So if I do rule.id is, and then 92213, and this is kind of nicer because it gives you like drop down boxes, which makes it a little bit easier to work with. But the downside to it is it doesn't have as many operators that you can use as you could in this like search bar, right? You have more options for operators in the search bar. Okay, but this is another way I could add a filter, and I could filter on rule ID 92213 that way too. So this is one dashboard that you can use to search events in Wazuh. The other dashboard is here. So if we go to Explore and we go to Discover, here's another dashboard that looks a little bit different, but gives us the same kind of like ability to search Wazuh alerts. We'll talk about like alerts versus logs in a second. But so here I could also do rule.id 92213. The neat thing about this dashboard that the other one doesn't have is on the left side, it shows you all the different fields that you can choose from depending on the log data that you have here, right? And for each of these, like let's say, right now we're looking at rule 92213. I don't know if it actually filtered it, but I guess it did. Let's say we want to look at the different source IP addresses associated with these alerts, right? Or with this data. I can actually click here, and there are a couple things I can do. If I click this search, or if I click this button here, it'll give you the top 5 values associated with the data that's here. So let me give you a better example here by not filtering on this rule ID. We're just going to display all the rules. And let's say I wanted to see like the top source IPs, or let's say the top, I don't know, agent IDs. Boom. And here it has organized like the top 5 values and by percentage. So that's really useful for looking for anomalies. Like let's say you want to see who's connecting to your web server. And maybe there was like hundreds of connection requests in a small time frame, right? That might be evidence of an attacker doing a brute force attack. That's one example of like where a top value would be useful. So if we want to do something like that, we would set our timeline to whatever timeline we want. So we can directly like specify a start time and end time, or we can say like last 24 hours, last week, something like that. So right now I'm just looking at last 24 hours. And then maybe I'm going to filter by, and I don't have the filters like memorized off the top of my head, but maybe I want to filter by a log type. I don't know. I would have to actually like think about this to build it out. But I could filter by Apache logs, or imagine I'm filtering by Apache logs. And then I could look at source IP, and then this would be really relevant because I could see the top talkers to that web service, right? So that's one thing you could do. The other thing you can do is you can actually add this as a column to the data that you're seeing here. So if I wanted to add this as a column, I just click this plus, and boom, now I have the source IP column, and all of the data that I'm seeing here like has this additional source IP column to it. So if I'm building out like, I probably should have prepared more examples. I didn't. But if I want to like, if there's certain information that I want to see here, I can just add it as columns by clicking the plus button here. Anyway, we're going to get into all this later on, but the major point to keep in mind right now is there are two places to see these alerts. There's the threat hunting dashboard and there's the discover dashboard. Okay. How does Wazuh actually categorize alerts, or how does it search logs, and how does it create alerts? Well, this goes into, we're going to talk about the difference between how SIMs normally do it and Wazuh specific stuff, because Wazuh does it a little differently than a lot of SIMs do. In a SIM normally, the first thing you're going to have to do when you get these logs, you're getting these logs from a bunch of different places, right? They have different formats, right? So your Apache logs are going to look completely different from your Windows logs. So you need a way of normalizing it or decoding those logs so that you can correlate, so that you can like do searches like these, right? So let's say maybe my Windows logs have a source IP, and my Apache logs also have a source IP, but those log files look completely different, right? I need a way of taking the data from the Apache log and being able to say, okay, in this log, this is the source IP, right? And a way of taking that Windows event data and saying, okay, in this log, this is the source IP. How do we actually do that? We use what's called decoders. Decoders take logs and decode them or convert them to a format that Wazuh understands. So if we go to Discord, under Wazuh usage, I have a link to the decoders documentation. And so this is the official Wazuh documentation that like defines how to create different decoders. I'm not going to go into decoder creation this time around. We might touch on it, but we might not, because Wazuh already has built-in decoders for you for most things that you're actually going to be using it for. So for any kind of like logs that follow the syslog format, like those Apache logs, I think follow the syslog format, and for Windows logs that follow their own specific format, it already has built-in decoders for that. But if you're ever curious to look at those decoders, right, you can always go to the Wazuh source code. You can go to, I think it's in rule set, decoders. And here we have the decoders. So for example, here for an Apache log file, here's how it's actually going to decode that log file. And the way it does that is using regex, or regular expressions, right? So it knows that the log file is going to have a certain set of words with spaces between them, right? So here it defines like there's going to be a word, then there's going to be a space, then there's going to be another word, then there's going to be a space. Then there's going to be like a different set of characters, like a number, and then there's going to be a space, right? And then it's going to pull out specific fields from that using these parentheses. So these parentheses, it'll say map this field to, in this case, source IP, right? Map this field to source port. Map this field to ID. This is the Wazuh specific way of doing it. Every SIM needs a way of like taking those logs and putting it in a format that it understands so that we can search it. The Wazuh specific way of doing it is through these decoder rules that it has, right? From there, it takes those logs and it assigns them basically a severity. So it takes those logs and it feeds them into what's known as alerts. Sorry, what's known as rules. Man, my brain is dying. Backtracking. Okay. It takes those logs and it feeds them into what's known as rules, right? And rules just analyze those logs, those formatted logs that we now have, and it decides how important they are, right? That's basically what rules do. So if we go to rule set and rules, and we go to our, I wonder if we have like an Apache one here. Yeah, we do. So if we go to our Apache rules, this is going to take the output from those decoders, so the logs that we got from running it through the decoders, and then it's going to match them against these different rules. Now, each rule has a specific ID that just defines that rule, right? So if you want to search rules by ID, it's really easy to do that. And they all have a level assigned to them. And the level you can think of as the severity of the log. So if we're creating alerts, this is how we do it. We would create a rule, and then we would assign it a level, and then it would alert if it's at a certain level, right? And
can we change the severity of
yes. So in these rules, first of all, you define your level. And then what you actually want to do with that level depends on you. So in my case, I decided, and I'll talk about why I chose these numbers later, but I decided that level 12 rules are going to get a low severity alert. I decided that. So when I was setting up my Discord integration, I said that anything that's level 12, send that Discord message and say that it's a low severity alert, right? Anything that's level 13, I made a medium severity alert. So we can assign these levels to specific alerts, right? Now, this is where it gets a little complicated because there are two different ways of managing alerts in Wazuh. One way this is the way that I just described to you is the way that I'm doing it. There's another way of doing it that I personally don't like because I think it's kind of a mess. But just for the sake of fully showing you Wazuh's capabilities, I could also go here to the alerting tab and then create what's called a monitor. And then this, I started digging into it. It uses open search. This is like an open search thing, which is what Wazuh is using under the hood. But it was honestly way too confusing for me, and it made more sense for me to just create alerts based on the rules than to use this whole interface. Because here we have to set up like a per query monitor or like a per bucket monitor, which would like take a set of rules that it found, and then from there we'd have to like specify like what we want to trigger it, what about the rule triggers it. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to get into it because I don't want to use it because it's complicated. But doing it my way is a lot easier. And this is actually a new thing, I think, in Wazuh. So the way that I'm doing it is like the original way of creating alerts, right? Mm-hmm. This is just a new thing that they added that I personally don't like. I could be wrong about that, but I think it is a new feature. Anyway, but these rules are pretty, I think, generally pretty straightforward. So we can have some regular expression that it tries to match on, and if it finds that regular expression, similar to the decoders, how it used a regular expression to like decode the log that we got. Here it's going to take that already decoded log, it's going to apply a regular expression on a certain piece of that, right? And if it matches that expression, then it will match this rule, right? Mm-hmm. So, and you can also have child rules. So, for example, let's say we have a main rule for anything that's Apache related, right? So anything that's an error message is going to be assigned to this rule ID. But within that, maybe we want specific error messages to be handled differently, right? Mm-hmm. So we can actually create a child. I don't know if I have a good example right here. We can create a child of this rule so that it both matches this rule. And then if it matches this rule, it'll be evaluated by the child rule. And if it matches that rule, it'll alert on that one, right? The way we actually do that is with this ifsid directive in Wazuh. So ifsid defines the parent of this rule. So if this is rule 30103, it is only going to be evaluated if the log already matched rule 30100, which is its parent, right? Now the childmost rule, I know that's kind of like weird wording, but the child of the child of the child of the child rule is going to be the one that in the end gets alerted on, right? So if we have a parent rule that's like level 15, but we have a child rule of that's level 3, it's actually going to be alerted as a level 3, or it's going to be considered a level 3, not the level 15. So it's the childmost rule that takes effect. Does that make sense so far with decoders and rules? Questions about that? I know it is a little confusing if you're new to it. Okay. So only 10:39. I don't know why I thought it was like way later than that. But anyway, okay. So, what do I want to talk about next? Let's see. Oh, yes. So if we actually go to, we have decoders documentation if you want to write your own decoders. We have rules documentation if you want to write your own rules. They also have a page that specifically talks about writing custom rules and gives you some examples. So if you want to see some examples of how to write a custom rule, this one shows you how to write your own rule that's like a child of an already existing rule. And then this second example shows you how to overwrite an already existing rule. Let's say you don't like one of the stock rules that ships with Wazuh, like maybe you want it to be a different level. You can actually overwrite that rule and change its level. So that's how you would do that here. Then we also have rules classification. So now let's talk about those levels, right? Like what do those levels actually mean? Well, this is where Wazuh differs from most other sims. Most sims, you can create rules on a log that you get, and then usually you would set the severity to something like low, medium, high, or critical, right? That's how it works traditionally. Wazuh actually creates rules for pretty much everything, where most sims you only create rules for things you actually want to alert on. Wazuh is different in that it creates these rules for everything, but then it assigns them a number from 0 to 15, right? And then the way that I chose to map it out here is I said anything that's 12, you'll see that most of 11 and down are for very specific things, whereas 12 and beyond are kind of the ones that you can make use of however you want to make use of them, right? So most of the stock Wazuh rules that ship with Wazuh are at level 11 and lower. And then if you want to create your own rules that you add, you can create them at 12 or higher. So that's why what I did is I said level 12 is going to be a low severity alert. I said level 13 is going to be a medium severity alert. Level 14 is going to be a high severity alert, and level 15 is going to be a critical severity alert. I chose personally to map it out that way, and that's how I set it up in my Discord integration file, right? You can also actually set up in the alerts dashboard of Wazuh, but again, it's complicated and I don't want to use it. But all of the other levels below that correspond to a very specific thing, right? So, for example, if a user types in a password incorrectly, by default, Wazuh said we assign this level 5. And the reason that this is useful is then if you want to look for specific things, like if you want to look for incorrectly entered passwords, you could actually filter by level 5, right? So it makes it very straightforward to use in that sense. Okay. Now we have all of the background that we need, finally, to start getting hands-on. So we're going to start getting hands-on. If you want to, optional. If you're burnt out and you just want to watch, that's okay too. Going back to Wazuh, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a visualization.
Do we have access?
Yes, you have access to. So if you go to wazuh.cyberhawks.lab, you won't be able to access it unless you can only access it from in Proxmox, right? So from your virtual machine, if I gave you a virtual machine, right, you'd have to open up Edge on there and access it from there. Alternatively, if you're not using the Proxmox setup, you have to connect to the VPN in order to access it. So another thing you can do, like here, I'm connected to the VPN, so you can also access it that way. But in the end, you'll go to https://wazuh.cyberhawks.lab. From there, your login creds should be the creds that I sent you in a Discord DM. And these should definitely work. There shouldn't be issues with these creds, hopefully. Actually, snacks would be pretty cool. Maybe I'll bring some snacks next time. All right, go for it. I will not say no. So now we talked a little bit about threat hunting, either in the threat hunting tab or in the discover tab, right? You can kind of like search logs that way. The other thing that's common to a SIM is being able to visualize things. Like, for example, it would be nice to know maybe the like top talkers on your network, so the top IP addresses that you see, or maybe you want to see something like I don't know, files that are being accessed on your machine. This is all possible with these visualizations. So in the Visualize tab, you can create a specific visualization for like one thing. Like you can create a pie chart or a bar graph or a normal graph, whatever you want to create. And then you can actually combine these visualizations in a dashboard. So in the Dashboards tab, you can take those visualizations that you created and you can create yourself a nice dashboard to get general information about your network. And that's what I want to do right now. I want to create a visualization. So I'm going to show you how to create one first, and then I'm going to give you a challenge. So let's create our own visualization. I'm basically going to like mimic this one that I already created. But to create a new visualization, you can go to the Visualization tab, right? So Explore, Visualize, and then you can click Create Visualization in the top right. And then you have a bunch of different ones to choose from. So you have to think about what makes sense to you. So this visualization I'm going to create, I want to see the highest severity alerts, let's say, that I'm getting, or highest severity rules, highest level rules, to get my nomenclature correct.
Sorry, John, the credential is the same as...
Yes, it is the same as for Proxmox, which will be really annoying because you can't copy and paste. I know, I apologize. It is a little annoying that way. But
So I have to type it.
either type it or you can sign into Discord on the VM if you feel comfortable doing that. I'm not going to touch the VMs, so. No worries. That's totally okay. Anyway, if you can't follow along, totally okay. But then you're just going to watch. But let's say I want to see the highest level rules so that I can fine tune them, right? So actually, when I first installed Wazuh, the way that I set this up is level 12 or higher I'm alerting on, right? But I want to make sure that while the environment's already running, it's not throwing out a bunch of alerts before I started attacking it, right? Because there might be some stock alerts that ship with Wazuh that they define as like a level 12 or higher, but for this specific environment, I don't want it to be a level 12 or higher, right? Or I need to create some exclusion so that it doesn't occur, right? So for doing that, it would be good to see like the highest level alerts so that I can just take a look at what those are and maybe make rules to exclude them if I don't want them. So I'm just going to choose like a vertical bar graph. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do like the the rule ID at the bottom. And then maybe I'll do the severity is going to be or the level is going to be the y-axis, just to keep it simple.
What is the visualization?
In Wazuh, explore.
Cool.
See you later, Mohammed.
I know.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So if we go to Explore and we go to Visualize, that's how you get to this Visualize tab where you can create a visualization. So if I click Create Visualization, I'm just going to choose to do a vertical bar graph because I think that's going to make the most sense for this visualization. Then we have to choose what we want, what data we want to use for this visualization. In most cases, you're going to use Wazuh alerts because anytime a rule is triggered, Wazuh calls that an alert, right? And the way Wazuh is designed, it has rules to trigger on pretty much everything, right? So you're always going to have an alert, although it might be like a low level, so we don't actually get it in Discord, if that makes sense, right? I know it's kind of confusing that Wazuh uses the term alerts, but really it's just that rule being triggered. It's not necessarily something that's like we're alerting on. The other option is you can do archives. So Wazuh, if no rule was triggered, or if there was no rule that matched the log that it got in, then it will just be logged in this archives, right? So archives lets you see things that didn't necessarily match a rule. Archives is pretty much everything. Alerts is just things that matched a rule.
So archive is something like if something did not trigger, it will save it in the archive.
Yes. Yes. So that's actually not entirely true. Whether it triggered or didn't trigger, it'll save it to archives, right? But only if it triggered will it save it to alerts. So archives is everything. It's all the logs after they've been decoded.
Okay, you have to
So
create-
archives is the decoded logs, whereas alerts is the decoded logs that then have a rule that matched. So in this case, we're going to select Wazuh alerts because I want to sort by like level of alert, right? And then from here, we can change the different metrics here. And we'll see if I remember how to actually do this or if I don't. But anyway. So
vertical.
the first thing I can do is I can define a search to already narrow down my rules, right? So let's say I only want rules that are maybe level 9 and greater, let's say. So I can go here and I can say rule.level is greater than 9, right? This is already going to filter down the data so that I only see rules with level 9 or greater. Cool. From there, I modify the x-axis in this case by adding a bucket. So I can say add x-axis, and then I'm going to select a certain term that I choose for to be the x-axis. So I forget whether I do terms or significant terms, but I think significant terms like limits what you can do, whereas terms like does all of them. But we'll see if I have rule ID here. Yes, I do, I think. So if I select significant terms, we can search by a certain field, right? So here the field I'm going to choose is I'm going to say rule.id. And then for the y-axis, so the x-axis is going to have the rule ID, and then the y-axis is going to have the severity of that rule. So I can just do because every rule has the same severity, it doesn't really matter which ones of these I choose, but I'm just going to say average, and then I'm going to say rule.level, right? And then I can, if I want to make this prettier, I can assign these custom labels so it says something different on here or here, right? But that's not too important for me. All right. Now, none of these changes take effect until you click refresh. So I made these changes, update. So refresh refreshes the data, update updates the changes that you made here. So if I click update, it's getting mad at me because I didn't enter a size. So I also want to show how many bars I want, right? So if I'm doing let's say the top 4 rules or something like that, I can set the size to 4, right? And that's only going to show 4 bars. I believe you can also set it to unlimited, but I don't remember how to do that.
11, 12.
But if I just do that, now we can see these 2 rules, 92213, and we can see rule 87702, and we can see their level. Sorry, I just clicked on one, which I did not mean to do. Whoops. My bad. All right. And we can see their level. So we can see that rule 92213 has level 15, and we can see that rule 87702 has level 10, right? And because I set a size of 4 and only 2 showed up, I know these are the only 2 that matched, at least in this time frame. But let's say I change the time frame here and make it maybe the last week. Now we can see that there are 4 showing up. So these are the 4 rules that were greater than level 9, right? Because we set that filter there. And here in the x-axis, we have the actual rule ID. And here on the y-axis, we have the rule's level. Or in other words, you can think of that as its severity, right? So now we can drill into specific rules that maybe, because I just installed Wazuh for the first time and I'm not actually running any attacks yet, I don't want to have it alerting 12 or more, right? Because those are going to be the levels that I use to alert on attacker activity, right? So I might have to fine tune these rules, but now I know which rules I have to look at, right? Now I know because this 92213 triggered at level 15, I know I'm going to have to take a look at 92213 and make changes to that so that it's not triggering, right? Or so that it's not alerting on that rule. Does that make sense? Kind of like the goal here and how we created a visualization for it. Now, once we create that visualization, you can click Save in the top right. I'm not actually going to do that because I already did that before, and so I have it here. When you click Save, it'll ask you to give it a name. So, again, if Wazuh is being slow, just like click out and click back in. Sometimes it's being
What name
slow.
should we give it?
And you don't give this a name yet. I'm going to have you do your own in a second. But I gave it a name, High Alerts, level 10 plus. And then I can actually click here to see the visualization. And if I wanted to create a dashboard with it, I could go to Dashboards and I can click Create New Dashboards. And then I can add visualizations that I already have to this dashboard. So I can click Add an Existing, and I can click that one. And now I've added it to this dashboard. And now I can add this one and a bunch of other ones and like organize how I want them to be on this dashboard. Anyway, now it's your turn to create a visualization. Here's your task. I'm going to give you a rule ID, which I don't remember, so I'm going to consult my little cheat sheet here. The rule ID is 87702. 87702 shows, and again, I'm going to redact this in the video that I post, but 87702 87702 is a rule that says, I forget the exact name for it, but I call it multiple firewall blocks from the same source, right? So if a machine is trying to access my pfSense firewall on multiple ports in a short period of time, or even using the same port but multiple times in a short period of time, right? That's going to trigger 87702. So what does that tell me? That rule 87702, it tells me, and you can kind of like, the only reason I put these on here is because these were the high alerts that I was seeing when I was like looking at it, but these aren't like special in any way. I just want you to keep that in mind. Like, I'm not showing off, these are rules you have to remember. No. These are just like ones that I happen to be working with. But if you take 87702 and you receive that alert, you know that means that somebody is trying to connect to your firewall, right? But nobody should be trying to connect to our firewall, right? Because unless it's internal, but then it wouldn't be blocked, right? This is specifically a firewall block. So if somebody's trying to connect to my firewall and my firewall's blocking it, that might be evidence of an attack, right? Like, let's say they're trying to scan the firewall, then we're going to have multiple firewall events from the same source IP, but they're going to be blocked by the firewall, right? So in the end, this rule can help us see machines that are potentially launching an attack against our firewall. Does that make sense? I know I didn't explain that super great, but hopefully that makes sense. Okay. So I want you to create a visualization of the top, let's say 5 IP addresses. You can filter by source IP that are triggering that rule. That is your task.
Maybe you should write it on your notepad for us to remember.
Top 5 IPs triggering rule 87702. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to see if you can do that on your own. You're going to have to, just as a hint, you're going to have to think of what kind of visualization would you like to see those top 5 IPs. Would you like a bar graph? Would you like maybe a pie chart? Would you like maybe something else would make more sense? So you're going to have to choose a visualization. Then you're going to have to filter by this rule. So it's going to be rule.id : if you don't remember. Or actually, it might be rule.id equals. I can never tell. There are like some, it's weird because there are some dashboards where it accepts : and there are some dashboards where it accepts equals, and I can never remember which one's which. But it's going to be one of the two.
But when we choose, does it have to be Wazuh alerts?
Yes, Wazuh alerts. Because remember, the alerts are the only things that have a rule ID tied to them, right?
Okay. So that means because some of these visualizations don't have Wazuh alerts in them. I saw
Yeah.
monitoring just now when I chose the data table. Do you get what I mean? So
Not
when
exactly.
When I clicked on
Uh-huh.
new visualization, I chose data table.
Uh-huh.
I didn't see Wazuh alerts. I saw Wazuh archives, Wazuh, but now I see alerts
So you-
for some reason.
Yeah, you have to choose one that does have Wazuh alerts, right? So if you
So you say rule ID by this, right?
yes, so the rule ID
Rule
87.
dot
So you have to filter by that ID, right?
Rule.id.
And then from there, you're going to have to display the top source IP addresses. And I believe for source IP, it's data.sourceIP. But you should be able to see it when you're like looking for data. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to like try to figure this out to the best of your ability. But then I'll actually show you the solution or how I would approach it.
It is that one.
Just to conclude, I'll show like the answer to this or one way of doing it. So if we go create visualization, and you definitely can do a bar chart. I'm just gonna do a pie chart because I like pie charts. We do Wazuh alerts because that's the data that we actually want to ingest, right? Now we only want data that matched this specific rule 87702, right?
Yeah.
So I can either add the filter, or I can search for it here. So let's say, just for fun, let's add the filter. Rule.id is 87702. And I'll click save. And now this is going to filter the data that we're getting, so we only have logs that match rule 87702. Now let's quickly add a bucket, and we want to split this pie chart into slices. So I'm going to say split slices. And then I'm actually going to do what we just did there, because that was cool. I'm going to say, instead of significant terms, which doesn't give you as many options, I'm going to say terms, which gives you like more options of what you can do with it. For field, so what do we actually want to like split this pie chart by? We want to split this pie chart by source IP. So we're going to go to data.sourceIP, and it's this one, not this one. I know that's a little confusing, but. And then, so what we're going to do is we're going to choose like how we want to order that data. So I'm going to order it by count, right? So we get like the top five meaning like the highest, they have the highest count, right, in the data that we're looking at. And then we're going to order it in descending order. So it's going to be the top 5, right? And now if I update this, boom, we have our pie chart with the top 5 IPs right here. So that's an example of how you would create that visualization. And of course, if you wanted to add more than 5, you can always change this. Like you can make it the top 10. And now we have the top 10. And another thing that I did, which I think was pretty cool, is you could like double bucket. So if I add a second bucket, let's say I also want, if this is too confusing, don't worry about it. But let's say I also want the top 5 the top 5 ports for each source IP. I could add a second bucket. I could say data.sourcePort, and I could add that metric in there. And it's not doing it now. Or I think it's just running. It probably has to take a while. Oh, because it's doing it for the whole week. Yeah, that might take a bit. But when that visualization is done running, there we go. You can see how now we have 2 circles, or 2 concentric pie charts. We have an inner pie chart that has IPs, and we have an outer pie chart that has ports for that IP. So it's just an example of like different things you can do with the visualizations. Also, if you don't like any of these colors, you can, I forget how to do it. Maybe you have to actually save it. Or no, you left click. So you can left click on any of these, and you can change the color for that specific thing if you don't like the color. So just an example of like different ways you can use the visualizations. So in summary, today we learned how to access the environment, we learned how Wazuh is set up and managed, and we learned how to create visualizations in Wazuh. And you practiced creating your own visualization that helps you see data, right? And if we go to visualize, I can see all the ones that you guys created. So here is Cornton's nice bar chart, which also works, shows us the top IPs. Here's Lucas's. He actually put in the description by Lucas, which is kind of cool. I like that. Here's Lucas's, which is also a bar chart. So different ways you can visualize the same data.
So, need to